Have you ever been in a fencing practice and you're just feeling super sharp, landing all those attacks and then you finally get out there on the competition strip and it's like it feels like a totally different sport almost.
Yeah, it really like training is one thing, and then competitions, it's a whole other beast, right?
Right.
And that's a challenge that a lot of people in the fencing world, they experience this.
And that's exactly what we're going to be diving deep into today. Why is there this disconnect between what we practice so much and how come it just doesn't seem to translate when the pressure's on in a tournament?
Yeah, we've been looking at what fencing coaches and athletes are saying, and some pretty insightful reflections actually on training methodologies and, drawing some inspiration from the ideas of Michel Sicard, who's a pretty influential fencing theorist.
Definitely. So, our goal today is to understand why this disconnect exists in the first place. Like, what's at the root of this training competition gap? And most importantly, what are some potential shifts that we could make to the way we train so that when you get out there on the strip, you're ready to fence your best?
Yeah. And before we jump in, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Fencing Family. They're an Etsy shop based in Los Angeles, and they offer a really great selection of fencing-themed apparel and accessories.
Hmm.
Whether you're at the club or just out and about, it's a perfect way to show your love of fencing year-round. So check them out at fencingfamily.etsy.com. All right, let's get into it. One thing that really stood out to me in the research for this episode is that it seems like there's this almost universal observation that a lot of young fencers struggle to actually use the skills they've been drilling when they're in a competition. It's like they know what to do, but they just can't execute it when it matters most.
It is really interesting, and one of the sources actually pointed out that it often feels like the whole environment, the demands of the fencing club are just totally separate from what you end up encountering at a tournament. So it's almost like they're training for two completely different things, which goes back to what you said earlier about it feeling like two separate disciplines.
Right. And I think you can even sense the coach's frustration in a lot of the material we looked at. I mean, they see their athletes performing really well in practice, they're executing the techniques, they're doing everything right, and then they go to a competition and it's like something just completely falls apart.
Yeah, it does seem like there's this assumption out there that performing well under pressure is almost like this rare gift that some athletes just naturally have. Some fencers are just clutch and others just aren't. And it's interesting because our sources actually suggest that this perception might not be entirely accurate.
Yeah, they're saying that maybe the reason it feels like some people are just born with this ability to perform under pressure is because we really actually trained for it specifically. We focus so much on the technical skills, but we don't necessarily teach athletes how to manage their emotions, how to stay focused when the stakes are high. It's treated as like a side effect of getting good at the sport rather than a skill that can be developed in its own right.
And that leads to another really important point, which is that this isn't just about physical skills. It's not just about having perfect footwork or knowing all the right attacks. This gap between training and competition is as much a mental and emotional challenge as it is a physical one.
Absolutely. Coaches are obviously super invested in their athletes. I mean, they pour their hearts and souls into this sport. And I think their own experiences, their own passion, maybe even their own past failures or successes can really influence how they react in those high pressure situations.
Right. And one of the key things that seems to be missing from a lot of training programs is this emphasis on decision making.
Yeah.
We spend so much time practicing what to do, drilling those specific techniques and sequences, but maybe not enough time on how to actually choose what to do when you're out there on the strip and your opponent is doing something completely unexpected.
Yeah. In practice, you're often responding to very specific cues or you're working on a very predetermined set of actions. But in a real bout, anything can happen. Your opponent might not react the way you expect. They might throw you a curveball. And if you're not used to thinking on your feet, making those split-second decisions, then it's easy to get flustered and revert back to those basic drills, even if they're not the right choice for that particular situation.
It's kind of like we're training fencers to perform a very specific dance routine, but then we throw them out onto a crowded dance floor where everyone's moving in their own way and they have to improvise. And it makes you wonder if maybe that lack of experience with unpredictability is part of the reason why some fencers struggle so much in competition.
And on top of that, it's almost impossible to truly replicate the pressure of a real competition in a practice setting.
Yeah.
You can do things like time drills or try to simulate the conditions as much as possible, but you can't really recreate that surge of adrenaline, the anxiety that comes with knowing that every point, every touch matters.
And, we as coaches, we love our structured drills. They're obviously super important for building that foundation of technique. But if the vast majority of training becomes too predictable, are we actually doing our athletes a disservice?
Introducing some less structured exercises, having training partners do unpredictable things, throwing in some unfamiliar scenarios, because that forces the fencers to think on their feet, to make decisions in real time, and that ultimately helps them develop more robust skills that are more likely to hold up under pressure.
So it sounds like it's about finding that balance, right? You obviously need that guidance from the coach. Their expertise is essential. But we also need to create space for the fencers to think for themselves, to experiment, to make their own decisions, and develop that sense of autonomy on the strip.
It definitely is about that balance, and it brings up an interesting question for you, the listener. As you think about your own development in fencing, do you feel like you're given enough opportunities to explore and make your own tactical choices? Or is the focus primarily on just doing what the coach tells you to do? Because ultimately, that ability to think independently is going to be really crucial for your long-term growth as a fencer.
So that brings us to what our sources call a proposed shift, training for real performance. And it's not about completely overhauling everything we do, but it's more about adding in some key elements that specifically address this gap between training and competition.
Right? It's about being more intentional with the way we design training exercises. So instead of just focusing on rote memorization and repetition, we need to create scenarios that challenge fencers to make decisions under pressure, to adapt to unexpected situations, to really think like a competitor, not just a student.
And a big part of that is practicing under a variety of conditions. Changing up the environment, adding in some distractions, maybe even throwing in some unexpected twists during drills, because the more comfortable fencers become with that sense of unpredictability, the better equipped they'll be to handle it when it really matters.
And this also means incorporating mental and emotional training into the routine. It's not something that should be an afterthought or something that you only address when there's a problem. It needs to be woven into every aspect of training so that athletes are developing those mental skills alongside their physical skills.
And one final piece of this proposed shift is to really involve athletes in their own tactical development, encourage them to analyze their own bouts, to understand their strengths and weaknesses, to contribute to the development of their own game plans, because ultimately they're the ones who are out there on the strip and they need to feel empowered to make those decisions.
When you think about it, this whole approach really aligns with the essence of fencing itself. I mean, it's a sport that's all about timing and intuition and responsiveness. It's a dynamic back and forth between two athletes, not just a static set of movements. And our training needs to reflect that.
So the takeaway here is that bridging this gap between training and competition isn't just about doing more drills or getting better at the techniques. It's about developing that mental agility, that adaptability, that emotional resilience that allows you to perform at your best when the pressure is on.
And for you, the listener, the key is to really internalize these ideas and start to apply them to your own training. Think about how you can incorporate more unpredictability, more decision-making challenges into your practice, because that's how you'll develop the skills you need to not just survive, but thrive in competition.
So here's a final question to leave you with. How could you introduce more elements of surprise and unpredictability into your training? And for the coaches out there, how can you create more realistic training scenarios that truly prepare your athletes for the mental and emotional demands of competition? What small change could you make today that might have a huge impact on your performance down the road?
Food for thought, right?
Exactly.